Good morning again. What a wonderful day to start the morning with two stellar speeches. I excused myself to escort them for their bilateral meeting, Minister Pradhan and Dr. Birol. But from what you heard from both of them, it is very clear that they not only have a handle of the present, but they also have an eye on the future. And it is the bridging of the present and the future which is all about what Energy Horizons is. As I mentioned to you yesterday, for those of you who were here, we've designed this logo with mathematics in mind. It draws upon the tangent secant theorem, which is used to calculate the distance from where you are to the horizon. But as you know, through that dotted line, the horizon keeps shifting. The question is, do we push the horizon forward, or do we succumb in the traps of our current mindsets? To do this in a strategic way, rather than simply through statements of intention, we need information. And as you heard from the video and the launch of the CEEW Center for Energy Finance, we're trying to take a deep dive into the kinds of information that we think might be missing to break down those barriers of information and make it easier for market participants, for innovators, for investors, to engage in this energy transition more fruitfully. Last evening, we had a debate amongst 4 energy CEOs up here. The motion was, this House believes that the energy transition will create billions of millionaires, effectively suggesting whether we could use this energy transition to drive not just growth in energy, but growth in the economy, growth in livelihoods, growth in opportunity for a much larger swathe of the population. But the question back here, why we are assembled in this morning's debate, is how do we then map this transition? And it is to discuss this that I'm privileged to have this stellar panel of speakers along with me. So, sir, I'm going to start with you, Mr. Anand Kumar. You've known CEEW for many years. You are at the, I can't say coal face, you are at the solar face or the wind face of driving India's electricity transformation. When you look for, from where we are today, 2019, to maybe where we want to be in 2030, what kind of metrics would you want us to assess as a country, as a community, as an international community? As Dr. Birol was saying, the world doesn't know India's story. What all should we be measuring? What is stopping us? Because the policies are there, the announcements are there. What more needs to happen to help us map out this transition?
Thank you, Arnab. The most important thing which we require to map up now is the demand. And demand would constantly change. And especially when EVs would come into being and it will become a major disruption in the whole economy. And also when the demand would increase from all households who have been electrified by March this year. So what has happened is only the basic electrification. But once you provide electricity, the aspirations of the families and the members, they increase. So number one, that how the demand is going to go up to 2030. As per our calculation, as per the present scenario and growth rate of around 6% assumption, we would require around 260 gigawatt of renewable energy and around 490 gigawatt of total energy capacity, electric capacity. And by 2030, we would require around 900 gigawatt of total capacity and around 500 gigawatt of renewable energy capacity. But today, if you see, our average per capita energy consumption is almost 1/3 of the global average, which is going to increase. So we'll have to constantly monitor how this demand is going to change, and we'll have to take necessary policy decisions to the changing scenario. This is one where you can be very, very relevant. Second thing is about the financing. How we can make affordable finance available for the energy sector. What are the new ways and means? And as Mr. Birol was saying that, he was putting a conservative figure of 80 billion US dollars. I put around 110 billion US dollars, which India has already been able to attract. And we would be requiring another 80 to 90 billion dollars to reach the figure of 175 gigawatt. So there again, how to attract finance, how to institutionalize, what key decisions we should take as a country and attract that finance. And the third thing, the ease to do business. Today we all are aware that India has a problem regarding making the land available. We are also having little issues on the transmission. Though transmission issues we have been able to tackle because we are already planning around 66.5 gigawatt of transmission, which will come into effect before 2022 to ensure that we are able to evacuate 175 gigawatt of transmission. But further on, the transmission would also require. So how to finance renewables, what is the demand? I think these are the two key issues you must look into. Thank you.
Ambassador Delago, you're representing another major emerging economy and a close partner of India. Your energy transition is slightly different. You're a world leader in biofuels. When you look at what's happening in India and when you look at what's happening in Brazil and you look at other emerging economies, where do you see the main issues in terms of kind of hitting that inflection point of the energy transition? To leave behind the legacy issues, whether it's in the power sector, whether it's in subsidies, etc., and shift to a completely different paradigm. What kind of issues is Brazil considering? What kind of reforms is it driving?
Well, you know that I've been very close to India because, as you mentioned, we have very similar circumstances. But in fact, we now in Brazil, we are quite famous for having so much renewable energy. But this renewable energy in Brazil was started for purely economic reasons and the fact that we didn't have oil and we didn't have coal. Right. So we started towards renewable at a time in which it was not an environmental issue, it was simply what we could afford. Yeah. On the way, we had some significant successes in hydropower, in biofuels, in wind, but now we are also a large producer of oil and a large producer of gas. So we have a very curious evolution of our energy matrix. But the fact is that our transition is to make sure that the proportion of renewable does not reduce in Brazil, because now in electricity we have more than 80% is renewable in Brazil. So our great challenge is not to go down. But what is, to answer your question directly, it's a question of economics. I think that we all agree, and Mr. Birol and the Minister made very clear presentations. We all know the challenges, but the solutions have to make economic sense. And I think that is what India has a unique position because of the scale. India represents a scale that nobody else has. And so I think that in coordination with many entities, but obviously very much in cooperation between our two countries, I think that most of the renewable energies will make economic sense in India.
Dr. Narona, I'm going to turn to you now. You heard from Secretary Anand Kumar, demand, understanding the demand, understanding the financial need, and then understanding the ease of doing business. And what Ambassador Delago said, and the word I picked up from your initial comment, that we are already at 80%. How do we not go down? A few months ago, I wrote a column which had a title, Renewing Our Vows on Renewables. And my first point in that refers both to demand and was like there should be no backsliding. We are setting really aggressive targets. We're leapfrogging, but there is always the risk of, should we backslide? So when you look at, again, from the UN environment perspective, you have developed countries, developing countries, emerging economies, all within your ambit. Where do you see this this challenge being met in a very strategic way? The challenge and the opportunity that both the speakers so far have already outlined.
Thanks very much, Arnab. And thank you very much for inviting me here, and congratulations to Center for Energy Finance, because we believe that can make a crucial difference to what happens next year. Very clearly, to answer your question, to be able to ensure that we do not slide back, to be able to ensure that you link the demand and supply very clearly, it's very important to understand the transition that is happening in the context of transitions in the economic system, not just in energy. Therefore, we have to contextualize how energy is changing the economy, the political economy also, but also how energy is being used to make the green economic transformations that we need to address climate change, to address pollution, as Fatih Birol mentioned, to address biodiversity challenges. So at the UN environment, at the UN level, there is a focus in trying to bring these things together in order to address and link up the planetary challenges with the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the moment you want to do this, you need to change the energy and the economic systems and move them together forward. And what does that require? It requires really looking at finance and how finance can move the needle of investments into more green sectors, whether it's energy or whether it's mobility or whether it is the food sector or whether it is transformations in the cities. You're required to look at the production and consumption choices, which can make very, very important possibilities for market transformations. And we heard that the consumer, the demand has to change, but the producer also has to change in response to the consumer. Therefore, looking at the whole consumption and production cycle becomes key. And finally, you need to look at what are the outcomes that you get as a result of this. Because if you do not pay attention to those who are left behind, if you do not pay attention to those who are affected by the transition in the energy sector or in the economy, you're going to have a lot of naysayers. You're going to have obstacles which are created politically, which do not allow you to move, and then you might have to backslide. And that's why, right from the very beginning, transitions need to include these various stakeholders in order to move forward. Now, if you look at mapping transition, you need to look at the structural changes that are already happening. And I'm sure you're going to have a second question, so I'm going to keep my answer for that. But for now, I would say embed the understanding of the energy transition in the economic transition, because then you will be able to make sure that you do not backslide, and you're looking at finance, you're looking at consumption production choices, and you're looking at outcomes. These would be my absolutely first measure.
So from SDG goal 7 onwards, all the way till international partnerships. Okay. Michael Renner from IRENA, I'm going to turn to you now. Just picking up from what Dr. Noronha mentioned, and what Dr. Birol mentioned in his speech, that both Dr. Birol and Minister Pradhan, that we have to look at the jobs, and Minister Pradhan particularly said we have to look at the jobs for the most unskilled people, because they might get hit by this transition faster than any one of us, and and this is back to what Dr. Noronha was mentioning about this whole economic system. How is it going to respond to how the energy system is responding? So again, how is IRENA mapping this transition? Do you have specific metrics? Is there an index? Should we develop an index with you? Over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Arnab, and thank you very much for having me on this panel. Hello, everybody. I definitely want to echo very strongly what Lisha was saying. We also at IRENA believe that you cannot look at the energy sector in isolation. You have to understand it in relation to the larger economy. So one of the efforts we are undertaking is, in effect, an economic modeling effort, which we call measuring the economics of renewable energy. Because, of course, as an international renewable energy agency, we believe that renewables, along with energy efficiency, have a very, very strong role to play in this overall energy transition. So what we do is we model the outcomes of a business as usual scenario compared with a scenario that is pretty much in alignment with the commitments of countries under the Paris Climate Agreement. And we look at the likely outcomes projecting forward to 2030 and 2050. So what we find is that on a global level, the outcomes in terms of GDP, in terms of employment, in terms of a human welfare index that we use, are very positive. But of course, once you dig down and once you go into the details, the picture is a little bit more complicated, right? So there are different outcomes for different countries, and I think we need to look very closely at what the opportunities and the challenges are. So I want to just maybe briefly mention we see some potential misalignments. If I can talk about this, for example, again from the perspective of employment, we see the potential for a temporal misalignment, right? You may have new jobs arising, but they may not arise at the same time scale as the old fossil fuel jobs and other jobs. There may be a spatial misalignment. You know, where these jobs are being created could be in different places, different communities, different regions, different countries than the old jobs. There are some issues with regard to the kinds of skills and skill requirements that we see. And that relates also very closely to, you know, what kinds of economic structures do we see emerging in place? What kinds of supply chains are, you know, how are the supply chains really structured differently than under the old energy economy? And so I think very briefly, what we see is that we need to have a very broad policy approach, right? So in the first place, we as IRENA look, of course, at what we call deployment policies, you know, feed-in tariffs, auctions, mandates, what have you. I mean, there's a whole array of policies that facilitate the deployment of renewable energy. There are some associated measures that help integrate variable renewables into the grid, that help to create the kind of flexibility in the energy system that we need more and more. But what we see is, as a result of these potential or to avoid these potential misalignments, is that we need to look very closely at things like what we call an industrial policy. How do we make sure that the economic structures, the supply chains really are able to back up the kinds of needs that arise in this transition? What kinds of educational and skill training policies do we need? What kinds of labor market policies are we looking at? And of course, the financial policies, right? So all of these, and I think what's central is not just to look at these in isolation, but to better understand how do they interact, how do they back each other up? What is necessary in one area in order to strengthen and improve the results, the outcomes in another. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
You know, about 400 years ago, Francis Bacon said, knowledge is power. Well, the problem is we still have very little knowledge about power, at least about our power systems. Last year, in his annual letter to his stakeholders, Michael Bloomberg ended his letter by saying, in God we trust, everyone else, please bring data. So we launched the Center for Energy Finance at CEEW in kind of pushing the CEEW agenda of data, data, and data. And to explain what it actually does, you're going to now hear from my colleagues, Kanika Chawla and Rishabh Jain.
Thank you, Arunabha. I think the opening comments by all of the speakers have given us the value propositions that we didn't necessarily identify for ourselves, but we can retrofit our Center for Energy Finance to meet several of those answers, or answer several of the questions at least. But I think that the idea for the Center for Energy Finance very closely aligns with what Ligia mentioned about how do you get the energy transition and the economic transition to at least be sort of, you know, doing a pinky promise of sorts, if not being more closely aligned. So in that context, I'm going to quickly introduce what the Center for Energy Finance is and how it came about, and then my colleague will walk you through some of the specific features of what we've put together. So as you know, and as you've been hearing over several sessions yesterday, but also earlier today, the Council on Energy, Environment and Water is one of South Asia's leading think tanks, and we've been doing work on a range of issues that range from here and now issues like energy access, renewable energy, and power sector reforms, to sort of looking slightly more long-term at issues around decarbonization of our economy by the middle of the century, the impact of climate risk on our communities, as well as industrial sustainability and competitiveness and decarbonization of industry. But then there's also over-the-horizon thinking that happens in the technology, finance, and trade program, where we're thinking about geoengineering and how would you govern some sort of geoengineering agreements, things like that. And in the middle of all of this, we've added yet another area of work, which is the Center for Energy Finance. So the Center for Energy Finance actually is in some ways a cross-cutting area of work that really thinks about how do you create markets to advance the energy transition across these different areas of work, whether it's for industrial sustainability, whether it's for power sector involvement, or whether it is, of course, for new technologies that are going to further the green economy. So in that context then, we thought, why are we're already doing all of this work, why do we still need another Center for Energy Finance? And the work that we've been doing on clean energy markets specifically actually isn't new. We've been doing this work since 2015, where we've been trying to understand what are the risk perceptions across different investor groups, and why despite our excitement and enthusiasm over the growth in the renewable energy markets, in early 2016, the tariffs discovered in India were still twice as much as what was being discovered in the Middle East, specifically in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And upon investigation, even though we all think that prices have bottomed out because technology got cheaper, which it did, prices continue to be riddled largely by the cost of finance. So in May 2016, when India saw its first 5 rupee bid, which was about 7 cents, 70% of the cost of that was the cost of finance. Today, when we're at 2 rupees 44 paisa, we're still at about 60% of the cost of that 244 being the cost of finance. And why is the cost of finance high? And that's exactly what we want to study at the Center for Energy Finance. And conceptual study, of course, we've done, but we want to monitor market activity every single day to try and understand what are these risk variables and what are the risk perceptions, and how do you delineate them from each other? Because risk right now is this big black box. So how do you split that into these are the real risks and these are the perceived risks? So in that context then, what we want to do as the overarching ambition of the Center for Energy Finance is to deepen clean energy markets. In order to deepen clean energy markets, the metric of success, of course, is that there is more market activity, that there is more dollars flowing into the market, but also that the reliance on policy goes down. So while there will be, policy will play a very critical role to encourage new technologies and scaling up of underserved markets, more well-established technologies that have been around for a while, that are seeing also market scale and maturity, really need to be guided more by regulation rather than policy. The policy dependency and the dependency on fiscal incentives needs to go away. So how do we intend to then do that? We want to increase transparency. And this is the point around perceived risk, right? The risk is perceived to be higher than it is because we live in an information asymmetry, especially in this sector where you are at the intersection of finance and the power sector, both sectors that generate a lot of data. There's no valid reason for why there should be this information asymmetry. And the information asymmetry actually exists for 2 reasons. One, that the data that exists isn't publicly available or isn't tracked, isn't monitored, but also that the data that is in fact available isn't very comprehensible, and that's because the two communities don't necessarily perfectly understand each other. And that is where the Center for Energy Finance comes in, where we want to analyze data and make it comprehensible for different communities. Investors don't need to understand every single thing that happens in a renewable energy plant. They don't need to know what it means when your hub height goes from 80 to 90 meters. They just need to know, does that make sense? Is it good economics? And in the end, as a result of reducing the information asymmetry, explaining what's going on in the market, but also why is that happening in the market in the first place, and therefore aligning with the economic transition, we also want to design solutions that will specifically attract certain pools of capital that are currently staying outside the system. And this is predominantly institutional capital that does not have appetite for a certain risk profile that is, at the moment at least, the risk profile of renewable energy projects. How can you underwrite those risks? How can you use public money effectively to do that? How do you move away from a policy reliance of the kind that is market distorting to a policy reliance that is market making? So in order to do this, we have we basically have two pillars of the work that we want to do at the Center for Energy Finance. One of them is on market intelligence and information asymmetry. And for that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Rishabh, who leads our market intelligence work, to explain to you what it is that we've produced.
Thank you, Kanika. While I'm here, I'll briefly talk about the CEF website which we are launching today, the center, the newly formed center. There are three key components of the website. One is the intelligence component, the other is the masterclass, and the third one is the solutions factory. Kanika will talk about the solutions factory. On the masterclass is a repository of qualitative policy or qualitative information, which includes information on policy, key trends. There are three important pillars of masterclass called CEF analysis, CEF explains, and CEF memos. There's a terminal, there are a couple of terminals outside, and you'll be able to have a look at the website, but it's also will be available to be accessible on your phone. On the CEF intelligence, I would want to spend some time on CEF intelligence. CEF intelligence basically is a dynamic and real-time data dashboard that has information on India, Indian states, and over 50 emerging economies. So on the left side, you see information on Indonesia. Every country page that we have on the dashboard captures information on key economic and energy trends, like per capita consumption of power, the renewable energy installation trend rate, the availability of energy, and the share of RE in the grid. In addition, it also captures the GDP growth rate, other economic indicators like what's the country credit rating. Another important feature that we have on the website is the compare feature. You can compare 3 countries or 3 different states on infrastructure, economic, and energy parameters. This feature allows you to compare countries across these 12 parameters. I'll show a brief outline on how a typical page looks like for India. This is an India page, and there are similar pages for all these states also. On the India page, you have 4 key tabs. There's an overview, there's a solar, there's wind, EV, and storage. These are the technologies that we are tracking at this moment. But as we move forward, we'll be including more technologies on various pages, both in India and outside. On an India page, you see there are some key indicators, like what's the installation like, what's the share of the installation, how much is the thermal power plant installed, what are the share of renewable energy capacity, how the trend has increased or decreased, what are the key states, who are the key players. In addition to numbers, we also have information on regulatory affairs. Say, for example, what are the GST rates, what are the duties like customs, anti-dumping, safeguard, which are applicable to various components of either solar, wind turbines, electrical vehicles, or energy storage. All this information is available and will be updated on real-time basis. Going forward, we plan to add more information on what are the latest market opportunities, what are the tenders, where are the tenders coming in, information on what are the latest memos. If there's a draft policy that has been out, we will explain it to you in simple words, and it will be available on various state pages. Information on net metering, open access, things like these will be accessible. All of this is very intuitive. You can download all the graphs for your own use. You can change legends. You can, if you want specific information from these graphs, that's also available. There are 2 terminals outside. Again, please feel free to drop by and make use of it. Thank you.
So information asymmetry resolved, right? No more information asymmetry. We're telling you everything you want to know. And if we aren't, please write to us and tell us what you would like to know, what we should track, because really this is our job now that we have a Center for Energy Finance, right? So really, please help us get better to be able to actually provide information that you'd like. But once you know what's going on, I think it's harder not to do something about the problem. Because the problem becomes very obvious, and then if you don't do anything about it, then it goes back to what Mr. Prabhu was saying to us yesterday. We have to acknowledge the problem first. But I think when you have all that data, you have to acknowledge it. So we're also going to try and do something about it, and that's the second pillar of the Center for Energy Finance, which is called the Solutions Factory. And I'll give you just a sense of the kinds of things we want to do. So on behalf of 17 countries, all members of the International Solar Alliance, in the May of 2017, 3 institutions, of which CEEW was the secretariat, put together a common risk mitigation mechanism, which is basically a pooled risk mechanism to create a secondary market for solar assets in developing countries. That's an example of an instrument that will bring capital into markets that are otherwise not attracting capital because of their small decentralized state. Another example of an instrument or a solution that is market reflective or response to a market need is what we're going to talk about later today in the afternoon session, which is called the Business Demonstration Facility, to support startups through that second valley of death. So it is as structured as a alternate investment fund for social venture purposes. It would be a supplement to existing institutions that provide incubation and acceleration services to support young entrepreneurs to go from technology prototype to market scale. But also very quickly, I wanted to give an example of what is the value of doing trends analysis, right? Because we feel like if you know the market and if you know the problem more or less in your gut and you have a sense check of it, you sort of know the solution also, but you feel like, well, the political economy of things is very complicated. What is the need to know exactly how much things are, or what does it need to quantify? And I'd like to give an example of that in the work that we do jointly with the IEA that also Dr. Birol referenced this morning, which is the Clean Energy Investment Trends, and this is the second year in a row that we've monitored this. And actually what it does is it presents findings that we already know, but it tells you in a way that makes the debate much more compelling. And in fact, I think it therefore can help us advance the conversation and actually change the game for investors as well. So one of the things that we find, which you would all intuitively agree with, is there is market consolidation happening in the renewable energy sector. But what we found is how much. And we find both in the solar and wind sector, 80% of new capacity in the last 2 years was installed by 10 new players. But what's interesting is that those 10 players are not the same. So year on year, there is a high churn rate, which is actually now, if you see for wind power, the churn rate is going down, whereas for solar, it's much more even. This is just interesting to know because it's what you know instinctively, but in a much more nuanced way, and it's based in evidence, and therefore you can use it for decision making rather than making just anecdotal decisions. But also what we find is that there is investor sentiment for the sector is picking up. There is a shaving in the interest rate spreads that are being offered to renewable energy projects, and that's a steady decline that we're seeing. But also your equity can actually now leverage more debt. And as you know, in the infrastructure sector, that's a really important sort of feature of these projects. And so we also quantify how these terms are improving. But what we also monitor is how are investors confident enough to lend to renewable energy projects for long terms? Because what we used to see was that thermal assets got much longer tenures than renewable energy assets. But what you see now actually is that renewable energy assets are getting much longer tenures than before, and independent power producers of thermal assets are actually getting lower tenures than even renewable energy IPPs. Of course, for state-owned PSUs, that case is different. So a lot of information like this is summarized in our investment trends report, which is available for you to see outside as well as on the Center for Energy Finance's website. But I wanted to give you a little bit of a sneak peek to pique your interest to visit our website and also engage with the Center for Energy Finance. So thank you very much.
Dr. Noronha, you were right. I have a second question, but I'm going to hold it up for a second. I actually want to bring in the audience now. Through the morning, you've heard about the energy transitions. You've heard the issues that Dr. Birol raised, the the vision that Minister Pradhan raised. And you've heard from all the four panelists today about the issues we need to be looking at very incisively. And clearly, even though, I'm Kanika's boss, so my job is to never be satisfied with what she and her team does. So while there's a lot going on in the Center for Energy Finance, you've already heard from our four speakers there are other stuff perhaps also that we should be tracking. So I want to open this up for a round of questions from the floor. When you hear the words mapping the energy transition, what comes to your mind? What would you like to know? What do you think you know, but when you read the information, then you say, oh, this is counterintuitive. So I'd really like to hear from you from the floor and give us examples from states, from other countries. Tell us, what does mapping the transition mean to you? Anyone? Yes, sir. And there'll be a microphone coming to you. There. And if you could just introduce yourself very briefly.
Surely. I'm Colonel Rohit Dev. I'm working as CEO of PRSPL, which is a bioenergy firm. My context and thinking is that when you say mapping, it has to be more futuristic in nature. And my problem in India today is that in the years to come, 4 to 5 years, the commodity called biomass will be used by the aviation sector, by the energy sector, by the renewable energy sector, by bioplastics, by whatever is bio in the biosphere will be using this biomass. So what is the mapping which the government as a vision has in say 2050 when the population is X? So how do you want to transition into the electric vehicles sector so that the roads don't use diesel and petrol? Similarly, various forms of energy, how they will be taken over by the new forms of energy. If we can somehow collectively in these 8-7 ministries map this first, so that each sector in solar, bioenergy, and wind energy, and small hydel, everybody knows what role at what step up and scaling has to be done. Because what will happen after 2-3 years, every ministry will take out a plan and will start running into the direction, and we won't have focus. So we have to decide when we have electric vehicles, when we have hybrid vehicles, when they go off the road, how much ethanol you want to blend for your fuels, how much ethanol for aviation fuel. Understood. So that will dictate the industry ahead.
Secretary Kumar, can I turn to you for this question? Because this is absolutely critical. MNRE clearly has some thought behind bioenergy. Other ministries have it. How do we map out this roadmap for the country?
First of all, we have to see the potential of various sources. What is the potential and how much we can exploit, and what is the long range? Wind potential. Initially, we thought it would be around 300 gigawatt, but then it was around 80 meters. Now the technology is changing, 100 meters, 120 meters. So what we thought the potential would be, it is now going up and is going many folds. So now harnessing wind energy, we can do it at a larger scale. Initially, we used to look after only about the onshore wind. Now we have offshore wind also. The potential has further increased. Solar. We used to have lesser efficiency of solar cells. Technology was not so forward. But again, because as technology is moving forward, we are again increasing the potential. So the potential assessment is going to be continuous exercise. And how much you're going to harness will also depend on the economy, the commercial and economic sense, which will be, because wind and let me give one wind and solar first, and then I'll come to biomass. Initially, we used to think that yes, wind is going to be cheaper than solar, and today solar is becoming cheaper than wind. And as the efficiency of the solar cells would increase, the potential of solar cells would, the potential of solar energy would increase. So you would see that the scenario has changed, and now more and more countries would harness solar energy than the wind energy. But then, again, wind has got its own advantage because it blows in the evening and the early mornings, and we can have the good hybrids coming up. Coming out of biomass, we are undertaking, again, biomass exercise. And this is biomass which generally which is available after harvesting. But then the story will not stop here. We will have to generate new biomass and from the quick going varieties. And biomass, again, the advantage is that it's firm in nature. And we would like to again, have the solid hybrids, the good hybrids of solar, wind, biomass, hydro, to give round-the-clock firm power. So, in short, I would like to say that this assessment of the potential has to be ongoing exercise. One, vis-a-vis that what the technologies are, how the growth rate is, and in which direction we are moving, and where it is going to make the commercial sense.
More questions? Yes. Mr. Kapoor. There, at the back, at the back. Yes, I will come to you after
Yeah,
that.
we are talking about energy transition, and today majority of our energy assets are coal-based. So in a transition, what's going to happen to these coal-based assets? Are they going to become NPAs in the future? Or is a transition going to embrace them? For example, we know right now, NTPC at Dadri has put up a solar thermal unit to be able as a coal saver. So what's this transition going to happen? I mean, there's a potential to be able to use heat in existing coal plants. Will that happen as these costs become comparable, or are we going to write off the coal-based plants?
Thank you, Dr. Kapoor. I'm going to take a few more questions. There was a lady at the back there. She's standing at the back. The lady in white or purple, I can't make out from these lights.
Hi everyone, I'm Professor Seema Sharma from University of Delhi, and I basically work on SDGs and environment, including SDG 7. And I'm very much, very happy that, the information asymmetry which is there, CEEW is trying to bridge that gap. But I have a very simple question that whether this information which is going to display there based on secondary data information, or CEEW is interested or going to create primary data generation,
Okay.
etc. I mean,
Okay.
this is what
Let's take
I want.
one more question, then I'll come back to the panel. Let's ask Daljit. Yes. Microphone here at the front, please. Here, right up front. Thank you. I'll come back to all of you in the second round.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm Daljit Singh. I'm an independent researcher. I work on the power sector. And I think one of the things that's needs to be done is the point that was brought up by several of the panelists, which is linking to this, the broader economy. And that's, in a way, not there on the this thing. Although I want to congratulate you on this is an excellent effort. But one point is what the gentleman brought up about what's going to happen to coal. And it's not just the coal plants, but it's all the whole entire coal industry, what happens to employment, resistance from unions, that sort of stuff. Then the other thing you want to look at is with the solar panels, are we always going to be importing from China? What do we do? How are we going to increase domestic production?
Right.
And the other thing which may be on your site is what is the quality of our installations? Because there's been some talk about the solar installations. There was a German study which said which really raised questions about it. And also, we do know that actually the PLF is low than expected. So that sort of information, I think, would be very useful.
Thank you, Daljit. I'll come back to the floor again. I'm going to break up these questions a little bit. On the very first question about this transition from coal, which needs to include coal and maybe different versions of what the existing assets can do, I'm going to actually turn to you, Dr. Narana, because before you took on your UN avatar, you were here at TERI. You know the Indian energy system and the Indian economy system very well. And this goes to the heart of what you were saying. The energy transition cannot happen, at least smoothly, without being a major disruption, unless we understand the broader economic ramifications. Now, with your UN hat on, how are you looking at this? Where does this energy transition fit in terms of what happens to the existing infrastructure? Not just in terms of stranded assets. That's something that financial analysts are worried about. What about stranded people, stranded livelihoods, stranded communities? stranded technologies, or are there other things? Some reflections on that.
Thanks very much. Again, putting on my longer term hat. First of all, in any transition, you have to take the long-term horizon, which is a point that was made by someone in the audience. And if you're looking at the long-term horizon, even your finance and your financial planning needs to be long-term. It cannot be based on short-term horizons here, and even the data that you have may result in short-term decisions, but you need to have a longer-term change, which is why in UNEP, since you also asked me about the global thing, we have been connecting our financial thinking across 3 areas, which is looking at policy and regulation, looking at sectoral changes within the financial sector, and then coming down to more transactional finance with regard to promoting investments in renewables, etc. Why? Because you need to create this change, which is much more fundamental. It cannot be done just at one level or the other. But coming to the Indian economy, and what I've understood over a long time is that the transition here is somewhat different from the rest of the world, and it happens also in other countries which have energy access situations, is that we are still complementing, we are not substituting, not yet.
Not yet.
So because we are complementing and not yet substituting, we still haven't felt the pressure and the impact of the transition on people and places and communities. Right. Why? Because we are still allowing the coal and the oil and gas to continue, while the renewable energy takes place, while the renewable energy is filling in the gaps and the access that we have, while the others are also going on. Where it will really start hitting us, which is why we need to plan today, is when the substitution begins to happen, because then you will have to transit out. This is the perfect moment to start thinking long term, and the perfect moment to plan about stranded places, stranded communities, stranded places also, not just stranded jobs and stranded assets. So, how do you think about it? There are various models. I can go on for a long time, but I won't, because I know you have still other questions. But you can think of funds, you can think of reskilling, you can think of ways in which you already start planning for different age groups in the coal sectors. You start thinking of revenues of our coal mining states, which depend heavily on those. So does the national government. So you start thinking of various ways in which this transition happens. But it requires some longer term planning, which feeds into the economy.
So, Secretary Kumar, I'm going to just, both Secretary Kumar and Michael, I want to take that question from Daljit about, this efficiency of panels. Is this something, is that an extra homework we should give to the Center for Energy Finance team? Or are we reasonably sanguine about the quality of the panels? And to Michael, this issue of manufacturing, right? We don't want to go from 80%, 90% oil dependence to 80%, 90% solar panel dependence. But we are actually. But when you again see it from an IRENA perspective, how do we build a global supply chain where countries are connected in manufacturing together rather than being mercantilists towards each other?
Thank you, Arnab. Let me also come into the first question regarding the stranded assets and thermal power. If transition happens gradually, then one gain offsets the other loss. As far as thermal power is concerned, there are certain old plants which we need to retire, and then there's a capacity gap which can be filled in through the renewables. Let's also admit that thermal power is very essential today for making the infirm power the firm power. And till storage becomes affordable, and we don't have so many hydro assets. So thermal power will keep on playing a very key role for next 10 to 15 years. But what is going to be important is have a proper policy in change, that how gradually we would change from thermal to renewables. And taking into account technology advancements in storage, and also enhancing our capacity on hydro and biomass and other firm powers. So this is as far as the thermal is concerned. and anybody who has jobs in thermal can shift onto the renewables, etc., etc. As for the second question is a base of around 30 gigawatt by 2024. And that would be made possible through the tariff barriers and the non-tariff barriers, and also by creating demand. So we have already said that we would require around 30 gigawatt of solar panels every year. So the demand is there. We are creating non-tariff barriers by putting in standards so that the only quality goods are here. And we have also said that only those companies would be able to supply to Indian projects who qualify and who are there in the ALMM list. This is advanced module manufacturing list which we are going to bring in force from April. And then it has to be compounded by the right incentives for the industry. May it be through capital subsidy or other incentives like income tax exemptions or so and so forth. So all these things we have to put in a policy framework and then ensure that yes, our aim is to establish 30 gigawatt by 2024, and that has to come, work backwards and put everything in place. Again, I'm saying for the energy security of the country, we cannot depend on somebody else for our demand. Thank you.
Yeah, so clearly I think in the solar PV sector in particular there is enormous pressure because we all know that the manufacturing base globally is centered in East Asia, right? Primarily China, also now a number of other countries in East and Southeast China. And so I think there is an understandable concern on the part of the importing countries. I mean, not just India, the same situation I think in many ways obtains in the United States as well. There is, I think, often a pressure for sort of very fast results, right? Sort of a policy that has some immediate effect. And I think it's a little too tempting, it seems, right, to take tariff measures, to say, we'll put up a barrier of sorts, and in the expectation that that will sort things out, right? But I think the experience typically is that if that's all you do, you're not going to get very far, right? You might put up a barrier, there might be certain consequences, perhaps short term, maybe there are some salutary effects. But I think the underlying structure is really not changing in the ways that you want them to change. So I think I would go back really to point to what I had mentioned briefly in the earlier remarks on industrial policy. I think there is a need to say, you know, what is the underlying structure and the capabilities that we need to build? What can we actually build upon in terms of the existing abilities industrially, in terms of skills, in terms of R&D? How can we steady that? What can we do in terms of, you know, building supplier programs? What can we do in terms of industrial clusters, you know, building R&D capacities and so on? And I think then maybe in conjunction with the trade-related measures, that might actually have much longer-term consequences. But the problem, of course, is this is not going to happen fast, right? There has to be patience, which often politically is not what's available, right? The patience is something that I can talk about, but those who are in positions of responsibility have to find ways to really come up with measures that I think take effect much more quickly, or have some visibility at least.
So roadmap, not a band-aid. A roadmap, not a band-aid. But we have the opportunity to learn from Brazil. Ambassador Lago, I actually wanted to, even though it was not directly asked of you, but I wanted to ask you, what can we learn from Brazil's industrial policy? Right? You said in your initial remarks that you were forced to look at renewables because you didn't have, but even though, you know, necessity is the mother of invention, even then, how does it actually unfold? What do you do? What measures do you put in place? Is it tax breaks? Is it interest subvention? Is it a tariff barrier? How do you create an ecosystem of industries, whether it's in hydropower or in biofuels? Tell us your story.
Well, what I really wanted to comment is that India and Brazil are very big countries with an enormous diversity of conditions and enormous diversity of economic circumstances depending on the region. So we need to look at all kinds of energies. we still need some energies in some areas. We can afford some others in other areas. So we're lucky because we have this diversity, but at the same time, we cannot have a simple solution that applies to all the regions. But I want to come back to the comment on the price of the price and the dependability on solar panels. I want to come back to bioenergy. There was a question about bioenergy. I think the potential of India on bioenergy is absolutely extraordinary. And I want to comment with you that it was necessity in the beginning, but little by little, it not only made economic sense, but it continues to make economic sense even having oil as we have. And for you to have an idea, we have more or less the same production of automobiles as India. India has just surpassed Brazil. 88% of Brazil's cars use engines that can use 100% ethanol if they want, or not. So if the price of oil goes down and the ethanol is more expensive, the consumer changes for the other one. So I think that the potential of bioenergy in India is extraordinary, not only because of ethanol, but because when we produce ethanol, we can also produce electricity. And we have a considerable part, almost 7% of our electricity in the grid comes from cogeneration from the production of ethanol. So I think that there are so many options and make so much sense depending on the region that I'm very optimistic about this area too.
Daljit, your first question about how this is also impacting the wider economy is something that we would like to work with other teams. We have a power sector team. We have a team on industrial sustainability, but we also have partners in other institutions. So while the Center for Energy Finance digs deeper into deepening, as Kanika said, deepening the financial markets for this energy transition, the other kind of the scaffolding needs to include many of the things you were mentioning. But Kanika, there was a question from a professor from Delhi University at the back about the nature of the data. And I want you to answer this. Is this, and for the rest of the audience, are we only drawing on secondary data? Is there primary data? What are we doing to the data? Are we cleaning it up? Let's put it bluntly. If I were a stockbroker in Mumbai, can I trust your data?
You can trust the data. You can probably trust our data more than you can trust most data sets, because also we cite every single thing that we use. So a lot of the data, especially because it's market information and it's about companies and it's about investment flows, it's not primary data, like we don't go to the company and say, give it to us. So it's a lot of information that is from filings that companies make to the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. In addition to that, of course, all the generation data, is from state load dispatch centers as well as from the CEA. And then CEA actually gets a lot of that data. All the power sector data, they get it from the regional agencies or the state nodal agencies. So that's the data on power. And then the finance flows data is actually at a project level, and the analysis that we did on the clean energy investment trends analysis with the IEA, that's also project level data. So every single unit of capacity that has been auctioned in the last 4 years, we've monitored it at that SPV level to say what were the terms, what is the site. We've done a geographical mapping of where is it coming, what is the transmission capacity, therefore that is needed, how does that map with the transmission capacity that is already planned. So it is actually data that exists somewhere. Some of it we get through RTIs, but mostly it's data that exists somewhere out there. We just find it, clean it, make sense of it, and connect the dots and present it to you in a way that makes sense.
Okay. We have time for one more round of questions. I'm going to ask you, you've been raising your hand for quite a while. There's a lady at the back and a lady there. I'm sorry I might not be able to come to everybody. Yes, please. And keep it short, then we can bring in more questions.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I have a few questions, but...
let's keep it to one.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Mr. Birul had pointed out the fact that they expect India to raise their renewable energy target by how much, I don't know. But is there a plan to look beyond 175
Okay,
gigawatt that
so
we're
that's
looking
an
at
easy
currently?
question to answer for Mr. Kumar. At the back, the lady in the striped T-shirt.
So one of the major challenges all across the world is to have flexible sources of power that are also low carbon. In this conference so far, however, I've noticed this sort of trend where it's spoken about very passively. Yes, coal is important. Yes, storage, we will wait until it becomes cheaper and then we will. But major technology changes all over the world have been driven by policy, or arguably have been driven by policy. Solar wouldn't have become as cheap if not for the efforts of certain countries. So, and this is also a huge opportunity for India, could be a huge opportunity for India. So, are we thinking beyond being passive and being more active in developing flexible sources of power?
No, clear. Very good.
Low carbon.
The lady in white there, across the room. Yes. Ma'am, there's a microphone in front of you. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Arunabh, for the opportunity. It's a wonderful platform, I would say, where we are having this discussion. 2 points I want to raise. One is a suggestion for the CEF. The technology is changing very fast in renewable sector. So maybe if you can add something on solar modules, how the technology is changing,
Right.
what are the price trends basis
Yep.
that. And second important thing, there is no one in the market who's tracking the decentralized applications, or
Right.
I would say the rooftop market as well.
Yep.
So if CEW can put in that effort, that will
So
be
that's a question
wonderful.
for me. I'll answer that. Let's
Uh,
try and.
So
Sorry,
there-
you had a second
yeah,
question.
So I had another second question with our secretary, Mr. Anand Kumar, that we are planning major energy transition from coal to renewables, and we're expecting almost 40% by 2030. But I could see that there are a lot of risks which are surrounding the sector right now, the DISCOM payments or the PPA cancellation issues which are there, which everybody is talking about right now. So I wanted to know how robust the system is, which will
Okay.
help.
Two very eager hands here. Let's get these questions in quickly. Then I'm trying to give everyone a voice. So the shorter you keep your questions, the more people can ask.
I'm Tarun. I work as an associate at a think tank under the Planning Department of Government of Andhra Pradesh. Something of interest for state governments would be to find out what the potential sources of domestic and international finance are for sustainable energy projects, and also not just that, for actions identified under the State Action Plan for Climate Change.
Okay. Very quickly, and I'll come there.
Hi everyone, I am Arupanand Patnaik, representing ORIDA, Odisha Renewable Energy Development Agency, Government of Odisha. So we have been seeing a energy transition starting from a distribution of the solar lamp and all to the utility scale of power plant, and for the community pumping, irrigation, everything.
Yeah.
But still we are lacking to address the rural people or the energy transition to the rural market. So
Okay.
how the reliability or the confidence of the rural people on
Okay.
the technology will come back,
Understood.
or will do
Understood.
some policy changes or no? We'll also request CEW to come Odisha for that policy and all.
We'd
but
be
what
very happy
factors
to.
is important for that to address the energy transition to the rural market? Thank
Okay. The gentleman in the burgundy shirt at the back, quickly.
Yeah, thank you, Anu, sir. Good morning, everyone. My name is Yogesh Kumar Singh. I'm a senior research scientist at National Institute of Solar Energy. So my question is, the congratulations for this, all the exercise. How do the data mapping, and can you doing the forecasting of the data, and also the reliability aspect is also important, like the degradation, safety, and quality aspect. So do you have covered this aspect in your data analysis, or what else?
Okay. Microphone right up in front. Right up in front. Yes, sir. We'll take these last two comments in front. Yes, sir.
As most of the people know, I am from National Solar Energy Federation of India. Sir, my question is that whereas we appreciate all the development so far, government support, etc., but at the same time, are we doing the right thing for this thermal coal side, where we have two-part tariff, meaning thereby that fixed cost we are supposed to pay for 25 years, anybody who is putting up today, which we are signing for 25 years, till 2045, we will have to pay whether he produces or not. We have to pay him the fixed cost. Whereas for solar, although our people are investing, in whatever 2-3 months of monsoon, if they don't produce, they don't get anything. Are we being fair?
Okay.
So in this new tariff policy that is being framed, we have submitted this poser. We should do something about it.
Okay, last question there.
I was just looking at the global energy and investment data, but that's a long story. The short story I could really see on the climate change front. I was just looking at some of the data where last 10 years, the CO2 emission growth had been 1%. Post-Paris for the last 3 years, the CO2 growth has been 2%. Now we are talking lots of things on climate change. We're talking lots of things on increasing renewable energy share. Where are we headed to?
Okay, so there are a number of questions for you, Secretary Kumar. So I'm going to just let you breathe for a moment and take it all in. But I'm going to first turn to Dr. Norona. Why don't you take that last question? And yesterday, we had another panel where Thierry Leperc said, we don't even have time for innovation anymore. We are headed so much down the road to disaster that we have to act day before yesterday. This last question, all of this would mean nothing if we end up with a 4-degree world.
I'm so very glad that question has come up, because that question puts onto the table the urgency of the moment. We can talk of energy security risks, we can talk of all kinds of risks, but if we do not attend to the climate risks, we are nowhere. That's an existential problem that we face, that we have to really seriously discuss and put on the table absolutely now. And to this, the answer, there is no clear answer, obviously. We all have to work together, act together, to see that it is not somebody else's problem, but it is our individual problem as a citizen of the world to be addressing. And therefore, it's our choices that are going to determine what changes we are able to make. Every single action that we do, every consumption choice that we make, has a contribution to make to the climate problem. So I think all of us, first of all, need to get our act together, not just wait for the energy transition or wait for some other transition. Having said that, there are lots of very clear actions which are required to be made, not only in the energy sector, but also in the other sectors. And one very strong way of addressing the climate problem is through nature-based solutions, what we call ecological infrastructure, looking at ways in which we are looking at carbon sequestration through nature-based solutions. And this is also something that is being promoted by the Secretary General at the summit in September, which is going to have a focus on actions and commitments by member states and other stakeholders in order to up the ambition, because everyone is concerned with the fact that carbon emissions have been going up. Now, with regard to India and even carbon sequestration in India, just have a look at how much of degraded land we have, which we could grow a lot on. How many coal dumps have been abandoned over the years, which if you were only to restore, you would be addressing the climate problem, you would be addressing the desertification problem, you would be addressing the biodiversity problem. You would find ways in which a number of these planetary challenges, just by looking at the abandoned coal mines, and in the process address the fact that these are coal mines. And so you're giving a very clear message to the states which are going to be affected by transition to say, hello, you have an opportunity to also start thinking of alternatives, maybe tourism or whatever. Exactly. So just to give you some ideas, there are lots more on the table, but for another time.
And for those of you who don't know, actually, in just 5 or 6 weeks from now, India will be hosting the COP for the UN Convention on Desertification. And, 1992, Rio was not just UNFCCC, there was also the Convention on Biodiversity. India hosted the COP in 2013, if I recall correctly, and now India is hosting the COP on desertification. So, and all of these things actually tie together. That's why they were initialed together in 1992 as well. Secretary Kumar, so many questions for you. The roadmap, other alternative technologies, the risks.
Okay, let me start from the risk point of view. India is a strong and resilient economy. We've got a very strong legal system. Till date, no PPA has been cancelled. We have said that PPAs once signed are sacrosanct, and we should abide by that. And in case somebody tries to go against this sanctity, then it can be challenged in the court of law. Our position, as I said, PPA sacrosanct cannot be tempered unless there is a clause of revisiting the prices which is mutually agreed. If there is a clause, I can't do anything about it. But if there is no clause, then it cannot be. Or, second thing, if there is a case of malafide or corruption is established I am saying, you cannot say there is a corruption. You have to establish that there is a case of corruption and malafide, then you can cancel that particular agreement. So, stand of the ministry, stand of the government is very clear. And I know the case in point. There is an issue with a particular state government. We have written to them, and we have put our stand very clear, and the stand we would take in the court of law also. One. And let me assure you that credentials of our legal system are well established, and this is not going to affect the future investments. Number two, you talked about rooftop solar. There are very many issues for catalyzing and pacing up installation of for enhancing the capacity additions in rooftop solar, because the moment high-paying customers go away, they affect the discounts. But in our new policy, which is called Shrishti, which has already been announced and approved, we are going to incentivize discoms for capacity addition on rooftop solar. And if they increase their rooftop additions, solar additions by more than 10%, they get X amount of incentive. And if they go, so we are incentivizing discoms for rooftop solar. The third thing about the distributed solar, the 100% household electrification has been made possible because of the distributed nature of the solar. We are going to make huge investment in the farm sector for the de-dieselization of farm sector. We are going to supply 17.5 lakh solar pumps, the standalone solar pumps for de-dieselization of farmers and for enhancing the energy independence of the farmers. We are going to also supply around 1 million grid-connected solar pumps for enhancing the income of farmers, and that too over the next 4 years. And more importantly, this is not only for the income of farmers, but it will add on to conservation of water. Because once you have a grid-connected pump, and when you can supply extra power to the discom, the farmer would tend to conserve water. In addition, we are under the recent Prime Minister's Kusum Yojana, we are asking farmers to set up 500 kilowatt to 2 megawatt plant, tail end plants in their fallow lands. The land which cannot be used for any other purpose, now the farmer will be able to use that for the solar farming. So, distributed nature of solar, mini grids, micro grids, standalone systems, all very well established, rooftop solar. And now what we are going to do is we are going to use the tail end solar generation for balancing the grid and also enhancing the income of farmers. recently you must have seen that, the way the floods are, people are charging their phones through the solar panels. Yesterday I saw in Rajasthan, farmers are drying up their dates with the help of solar panels. So we are in a big way working for distributed solar and use of solar heat. So we always talk about it, end up talking only about the electricity part of it. We never talk about the heat. So we also are trying to develop heat for schooling, drying, heating, etc. So, and cooling, that's what I said. So. And the day before yesterday, I saw that EcoFrost is one of the companies, which is working on providing the cold storages through solar panels. So what our ministry is working is on the comprehensive harnessing of solar heat and electricity. May that be through the distributed nature or through the grid company. So this is your second part of the question. Now, coming out of the flexibility, the new flexible sources, we are working on hydrogen, and hydrogen is going to be again major game changer in the years to come. And it's a huge capacity of being the energy retailer. So we are working on hydrogen, and let's see that how we would be able to. Denmark, most of the transport is running on hydrogen. Japan has done huge work on hydrogen. So we are also working on hydrogen, and we will exploit the resources, the flexible resource of hydrogen for energy, energy conservation, energy storage. My friends, regarding the target for solar energy, we will definitely achieve 175 gigawatt. As we speak today, we have already established 80 gigawatt of, a little more than 80 gigawatt of RE capacity in the country. 28 gigawatt is under various stages of installation. So that takes us to 108. And then we have got another 40 gigawatt, which is under various stages of building. So we are almost there, and we would like to. So that's what I'm saying. So this is 175 by 2022. By 2024, the figure is 260. And by 2030, on a conservative estimate, 450. But on my personal estimate, as the EVs would come in, and as the energy demand of average household would increase, I put that figure at 500.
As I said yesterday, this is what a leapfrog looks like. There is one burning question. I'm going to give that microphone to the gentleman there, if you could. And then I'm going to have final round from the panelists. We'll just wait for the microphone to switch on.
Can you?
Yes.
Yeah, this is better. Thank you. It's not really a question, if you permit me a comment. My name is Ajay Vikram Singh. I'm an oil man of 25 years and very proud to be one. Although these days I'm undergoing an energy transition myself. My friend Thierry Leperc introduced me to hydrogen some years ago, and I'm absolutely convinced. But if I may, I think the answers, that was a great question. And the answers we had, I entirely agree, and I appreciate the very laudable efforts of the government and other stakeholders. But some lessons from the oil industry, which might be relevant here. In the oil industry, we are concerned about the license to operate, the social and media pressure, legal pressure. Quite frankly, we are not worried about the commercial or financial viability as an industry. We are taking investment decisions on projects which are breaking even today at $25, $30, $40 a barrel.
Right.
So even if oil prices halve, we can see a pathway to survive. Of course, there are differences. But there are three lessons here which might be relevant. It seems to me the whole renewable revolution, especially in India, is coming up against some structural bottlenecks. Technology exists. Those solutions are probably not the issue. Number one is distribution channels. You're relying on an electricity system which is dysfunctional.
Okay.
The same consumer who's happily paying for petrol and diesel at market prices is not paying electricity rates. So clearly that channel has to be bypassed. And perhaps this is a policy measure that the government really has to embrace if it wants to truly unlock the potential of renewable energy. That's point one. Point two, I would say, is you've got to bring in equity, big equity capital into this industry.
Yeah.
with the exception of US shale, most of the upstream investment in my industry is done based on equity investment. We are happily investing billions of dollars in projects, 20, 30 billion per project, which takes 5 years before the oil and gas actually start flowing, in which time geopolitics and markets change. We know how to handle those risks in the large oil companies. But we can do that because we deploy equity capital. We don't insist on long-term take-or-pay contracts for everything we do. Many years ago, I helped Shell start its LNG business in India. We couldn't find any long-term customers to take our gas before the investment decision, so we took the risk on equity. So think of a way of bringing in equity capital, the big players into renewables, that will help. And point number 3, although the renewable industry has done a great job of getting cost out of the system, I think that effort needs to really continue and go to perhaps even less than half the current levels. Just like the oil industry has managed to bring break-even points to $25, $30 a barrel, so also, because price volatility is a fact of life. You're going to have to deal with it. That's the nature of the energy system, whatever technology you use. It's a function of politics and how the industries have evolved. So dealing with price volatility is another thing. The good news is renewable industry projects payback periods, or I would say gestation periods, post-investment till you start actually producing are far shorter than in oil and gas. So I hope these lessons will be relevant.
Thank you for the reality check. I'm going to come back to the panel for literally 30-second answers. We are trying to map a transition. There is no inevitability of how the transition will unfold. So if there were one type of information that you think if you had today, or if you had 5 years ago or 10 years ago, the world would have looked a little bit more different than what it is today. So, and if we could start investing. So what is that one type of information? It could be about jobs, it could be about finance, it could be about lessons from oil and gas sector. What is it that we did not know, that if we did know, we could speed this up even more? Maybe I'll start in the other direction. Michael.
I think I'll just stick with my bias, which is with jobs.
Jobs, okay.
I think if we had better we're trying to work on this, but if we had better information in terms of not just what renewable energy can generate in jobs, but also how does that really influence the overall employment situation in the energy sector, in the economy, I think it will help us to understand better what kinds of policies do we need to have in place to ensure a just transition, because it's not just price and technology and matters like that, but it's also the social and socioeconomic aspect.
Okay. Ambassador Lago?
No, I think data, because I think the decisions, the options, there are so many options, there are so many things that can be done. And as was presented here, if you have the data, you can really make the right choices. And I think that that's what was missing some years ago, and some choices were wrong because there was no information.
Okay.
I don't know if you had a better insight into technology, the way technology is improved, then we wouldn't have had the kind of issues which are facing today.
Okay. Dr. Narona?
I think for me, the understanding, the data has been growing, technologies have been moving very fast, information has been coming on. It's the realization what all of this means to the future and what this means to our children and grandchildren is, I think, what would have made the changes. And this is beginning to happen now with more and more of the children and the young people coming to the table and pushing us. And now you're going to see a fastening up of the transition because people are beginning to realize that time is really short. The transition is well on its way. We need to speed it up. We need to address all of the issues that we've heard, but we cannot be complacent, and that does not go only for government. We keep thinking of government as being the solution to our problems. We are the solution to our problems, so we have to act now.
I will reveal my bias for what information would have sped this leapfrog up even more, and that is about attribution science. Once we get to know that X storm is not maybe caused by climate change or not, this happened with this much greater intensity because the climate was half a degree warmer. And that then hits my insurance premiums, whether for my factory or for my home. I think if we knew this 10 years ago, with the kind of precision that we are beginning to get even now, I think things would move even more. So while we have a Center for Energy Finance, I hope we can keep investing collectively on climate risks, because bringing the future forward and understanding it maybe will give us the nudge that we still haven't got. Thank you very much for joining in a very stimulating conversation. Thank you to my co-panelists for illuminating us.